The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I want to take a call on the Wild Powers Amendment Bill. I did sit on the Select Committee and heard the submission. Sir, can I begin by thanking the Minister and the Chair for bringing this bill to the House? I think you're absolutely right. I was convinced by the speech that you gave in earlier readings and also by the evidence that was presented at Select Committee that there is a need for greater enforcement powers to protect our wildlife, particularly our lizards, our geckos, our tuatara, but also our birds from unscrupulous people, particularly from overseas, who are trying to steal what are endangered species to add to the collections, both alive and dead, of people from overseas who think that they've got a right to come into our country and take what is ours, and to put at risk the viability of some of those populations. And I know from down in my own patch in Otago, you know, the giant skink, these are very, very low numbers of these animals. We all know where they are. They're in a small number of reserves that are often fenced these days to protect them from predators around the Crays and near Alexandra, down up behind Earnsglue. And it wouldn't take much for those populations to be completely cleaned out and for us to be responsible for the extinction of another species. And it is absolutely right that we give the Department of Conservation officers the power they need to properly prevent that. And therefore, I'm absolutely supportive of these additional powers of search and seizure that have been given to Department of Conservation. And I thank the Minister for bringing this to the House in the hope that we can make it less likely or less frequent that these abuses of New Zealand law will be detected and prevented. So thank you for doing that. Can I mention a submission that was made by the Fish and Game Council? Fish and Game, of course, have a delegated responsibility for looking after our game birds in New Zealand, amongst other things. The Department of Conservation doesn't do that in respect of introduced game species, ducks and the like. And the Fish and Game Councils throughout New Zealand have been given that role by Parliament, and they fulfil an important function to manage those species. And they do that through a number of ways. They protect habitat. In fact, they do more to protect habitat of those sorts of animals than anyone else. They police bag limits and they police seasons. And so they came along and they said, we should have the same powers as are extended to the Department of Conservation. The advice from officials was that they shouldn't. And I agreed with officials that they shouldn't have all of those additional powers, although not the logic that was used for that reasoning. The department came and said that because the Department of Conservation are government officials, they're bound by a code of conduct, which means that they have somehow are more appropriate to have these extended powers than the Fish and Game Council. I don't think that is a justification. Parliament has seen fit to give those powers, or to give this area of power to Fish and Game Councils, and if they needed those powers of search and seizure, then they should have them. They are bound by the statute, and I didn't think the fact that they weren't government officials was a point of difference that was relevant here. What I did, though, think was that they didn't need the powers. So whilst we do need powers to protect our lizards and geckos and things from being stolen and taken offshore, I haven't heard many mallard ducks being targeted by overseas smugglers, sir. And so I wasn't convinced that the Fish and Game Council, who I've got high regard for and done a lot of legal work for over the years, I didn't think they needed the additional power. And on the basis that you shouldn't give any government official, whether it's Fish and Game Council under their delegated powers or the Department of Conservation, any broader powers than they need, I didn't think they should have the additional powers. But there is one exception, and it's one, sir, that relates to my supplementary order paper, which arises from the fact that under prosecutorial guidelines, for a prosecution to be laid in the courts by the New Zealand Fish and Game Council, they have got to include the date of birth of the person who is being... Mr Chairman.
David Parker.
Under the prosecutorial guidelines which bind Fish and Game, and they have to comply with, they cannot bring a prosecution for someone hunting without a licence or out of season or excessive bag limit or using the wrong firearms. They can't bring any of those prosecutions if they don't know the person's date of birth. And it is an absolute nonsense that they haven't got the power to require people to give them their date of birth. And so the Fish and Game Council, although I didn't agree that they needed the broad suite of powers that have been given to the Department of Conservation, they absolutely do need the power to ask for someone's date of birth. It's not enough that they can get someone's address and name. As Paul Foster Bell said at Select Committee, he has at periods lived at the same address as his father, who shares the same name, and therefore... Your grandfather, thank you, sorry, Mr Bell. And therefore, in order to differentiate from him and his grandfather in a prosecution sense, you've got to be able to have the date of birth. Otherwise, you might serve the information on the wrong person. And in any event, if you didn't serve it on the wrong person, you can't file the prosecution anyway because the prosecutorial guidelines say you've got to have the date of birth. So it's an absolute nonsense that Fish and Game Council haven't got the ability to require someone to give them their date of birth, because otherwise they can't meet their statutory duty, which we have in Parliament conferred upon them in respect of game birds to have the date of birth. Now, the officials at the time said to us, and it's recorded in the minority in the report of the committee, the whole of the committee recorded that that it would be a useful power for full-time fish and game rangers, but it wouldn't be necessary to extend the power to honorary fish and game rangers because honorary rangers are generally accompanied by full-time fish and game rangers. And that's what we were told by our departmental advisors. Didn't seem right to me, and you will see that the minority said that we weren't convinced that they shouldn't have the power to ask for the name and to ask for the date of birth, or to require the date of birth to be given. Sure enough, after this, our report became public. Fish and Game contacted, I think, virtually every member in Parliament to say, well, actually, the advice from officials is wrong anyway, because most of the prosecutions are carried out by honorary rangers. And they're the people who give the infringement notice out when they're good members of civil society. They go through the same training as full-time rangers, very similar to the training that's given to DOC rangers. We had that evidence at Select Committee that there was no lower quality of training or somehow irresponsible conduct on the part of honorary rangers. If that was the case, we'd be taking away the existing powers that they've got to give name and address, sir. So while I didn't agree that they should have power to seize cell phones or other things that we're giving to the Department of Conservation, I do agree that they need the power to require someone to give their date of birth to comply with the government's requirements that they do that when they provide that information when they file an information which is charging someone with an infringement. So, sir, that is what my supplementary order paper does. It actually gives the power to honorary rangers to ask for a date of birth. And I hope that government members are going to support that, because the Minister shakes her head. Minister, I'm disappointed. It is an absolute nonsense. It's an absolute nonsense that they've got the power to prosecute. They need the power to get a date of birth in order to be able to prosecute, and the Minister's saying we're not going to trust them. Not going to vigilantism. They might. Mr. Foster Bell, yeah, I'm sure that's said in mirth. This is a farcical situation. This is like Yes Minister. I was disappointed that the Select Committee wouldn't make this common sense recommendation themselves by unanimously that if the prosecutorial guidelines require a date of birth, that it's obvious that those people who are actually doing the prosecuting or writing out the infringement notices that forms the basis of the prosecution have to be able to gather the evidence that's required by the government to be submitted at the time the information or the infringement notice is put into court, which is the date of birth. I do not think that is an infringement of civil liberties. I think it's ridiculous to think that DOC need that power but that fishing game don't, and the illogic will...
Mr Chair.